I'd like to welcome everybody to this Longchen Foundation event being hosted here at the Buddhist Society, and to thank the Buddhist Society for making their premises available to us, especially to Louise Marchant who organised it. Maybe just to say a couple of words about our speaker this evening, Rigdzin Shikpo. Rigdzin Shikpo has been a practicing Buddhist for over 50 years now, and among his Tibetan teachers, I think have been some of the greatest meditation masters to have taught in the West, I think in the last 100 years. Perhaps chief among those is Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was one of the first Tibetans to teach in the West. He first came to Britain in the mid-1960s, first living in Oxford and then latterly in Scotland. I think it was in the year 2000 that Rigdzin Shikpo gave a series of teachings structured around the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. This wasn't a conventional presentation of the truths, however, and was based very much on teachings that came from Trungpa Rinpoche, a special approach. Several years ago, I had the great privilege of being asked to take the transcripts from these teachings and turn them into a book, which came to fruition at the end of last year, being published as Never Turn Away, The Buddhist Path Beyond Hope and Fear. So I'm pleased to say that this evening Rigdzin Shikpo has kindly agreed to give some teachings based on the inspiration of those teachings. Just on a practical matter, if you have questions, and we do hope that you will have questions, if you could please leave them until the end of the talk, and we'll endeavour to cover as many as we can. And after the talk this evening, we're offering tea and biscuits, so hopefully we can stay, and also that we're offering copies of the book. The book's Never Turn Away is offered for sale, and Rigdzin Shikpo has offered to sign copies, autograph copies for people that would like that. So, okay, that's enough of me. So, thank you.
Thank you, David. In fact, I think this the title of this talk is Never Turn Away. It's a particular aspect of that title that I'm interested in tonight. And that is that perhaps the rather obvious one, that never turn away means that to every experience you encounter, you don't shy away from it, hide your head, but face it straight as well as you can. Obviously there's training involved in this. You don't expect to be able to do this just because it's a good thing to do. Buddhism has never been difficult to know whether people often say, is it a religion? I'm not sure. Most books say it is, so let's say it is. And then if it is a religion, perhaps it's a little different. In the direct experience is the most important thing, really the major thing in Buddhism. And Buddha Dharma, the way of the Buddha, and that direct experience comes from turning towards things all the time. But in order to do that, as I'm kind of suggesting here, you have to train. And the training is in three things. You have to have a training in Shila, which is sometimes translated as morality, which is perhaps more correct way of behaving, in the sense of non-egocentric way of being. It's a kind of lifestyle that is with the minimum of egocentricity that you feel you can do it yourself. It's certainly not a question that it's not a prescriptive system in that you kind of look at some text and the text says you mustn't behave like this, you mustn't behave like that, therefore I'd better make sure I don't. That doesn't work. And if you think you can pull it off, you might pull it off for a bit and then you sort of become sick of it. and we might become sick of the path, and that would be a great shame. I know that there are some people who carry that kind of thing to extremes, in the sense that, for example, Buddha says you shouldn't have ego, so therefore maybe you shouldn't use the word self, and maybe you go around trying to avoid using the word self. That's silly. So don't bother with anything like that. You train yourself to the important thing, first to see what the nature of self is. What happens when you put yourself in different situations, how you react to those situations, how your strong emotions, hatred, desire, pride, Trungpa Rinpoche used to call it your inherent paranoia, how all that operates. And he used to say, instead of trying to say, you've got to avoid all that, try and find it interesting. Try and find it interesting how your desires and even your so-called emotional poisons, as it were, try and find out how they operate. Find it interesting. Be like a kind of physician to yourself, in a sense. In that if you're a physician, you have to find out about the patient before you can prescribe anything. So do try and do that. That's very important. So Shila really relates to that kind of thing. What's the style that gives you the space to enable you to see that kind of thing? Next, you have to train in meditation. And what we suggest, and what most of the masters that I've had a connection with suggest, is that the meditation is very simple. Doesn't involve a lot of use of concepts, imagery, and so forth, but it's simply trying to relate to the simplicity of the stream of your thoughts, emotions, mind, and so on. When you're sitting, it's very important to be able to have a period of time with yourself. Not particularly to calm yourself down, although of course people think, wouldn't it be lovely to be the kind of perfect Buddhist, which is thought to be a very relaxed kind of person. But actually, most perfect Buddhists you might meet might be quite kind of irritable and frenetic in some ways, because they're working with all that kind of material. And you have to work with that kind of material, not only in everyday life, as I was just describing, but also when you're relating to your meditation practice. You have to give yourself the space there as well. And you think that as you relax your mind, usually the very old Buddhist theme in conjunction with the breathing, then it gives the arena, the backdrop of your mind, an uncluttered feel. And then various actors can appear, some of whom you'd never seen before. You didn't know what they were and what they were up to. But you give them space to appear. Could be a shock, what you see. But if you keep up that interest that I was speaking of, that will be more than compensation for anything that is a bit shocking. And finally, which perhaps I wanted to make a theme really, is the third kind of training that is called prajna, or wisdom. It's said that wisdom comes in 3 different ways. You need to be introduced to wisdom, the ideas, by somebody. the teacher, as we say. You need to think about what you've learned, and then you need to put it into practice. Putting it into practice has to come from a certain stability of mind. That's the purpose of meditation. It's not like all these things have to be perfectly accomplished first. It's not like, you have to be, in the first instance, have a lifestyle that's totally free from egocentricity. None of us is going to manage that. But at least you could, as it were, make a shot at it. And as I say, learn something about yourself in the process of making a shot at it. Then, secondly, you stabilize your mind through meditation. But that's not going to be perfect either. But that doesn't matter. If you do it sufficiently, if you do it enough, the wisdom aspect will begin to manifest. That's sometimes described as the fact that I talked about the shocking things that might appear, the shocking persons that might appear in your mind, in the sense that, for example, you might have more desire than you realise. You might have thought yourself a sane person. Now you realise there's a bit of craziness in there that you never actually realised and you never suspected. And people sometimes become alarmed when that happens. So it's very important to relax into the sense of just being interested in what you are. And that's perhaps more important than anything else. So you learn things that way. But that isn't, although that's wisdom of a kind, it's not really the deeper aspects of wisdom that eventually that one might arrive at through meditation. The deeper aspects are, when I was saying you first practice so that you get some sense of non-ego through training yourself not to be egocentric. A shocked sense, perhaps in meditation, that your ego is more uncomfortable than you realise. The third aspect is to realise that fundamentally that sense of ego that we all grasp at very strongly actually will collapse under the effect of true vision. And that perhaps is the most uncomfortable experience of all, because it's like, what would I do without a self? Everything I think of is based on that. I think perhaps that I wouldn't be able to feel anything if I didn't have a self that feels. I would hardly be able to act in the world, because I think, well, it's myself that acts. And it turns out that this is something, a public relations exercise of ego, really. Turns out things work better when ego isn't around. I could say the deep understanding is that ego never was around in the first place. But at least there's the sense we have that it is around, that it does exist, that it does mean something. But actually, the characteristics that it seems to have, that sense of solidity, that sense of permanence, that sense of unity, when we look for it where we think it is, which is in the one that we think that observes and knows and thinks and acts, we find that's the place that it collapses. And when that happens, people feel emotionally bereft of something. So it's a very uncomfortable experience. That's, according to some traditions, when you have an experience like that, and it's strong enough, as it were, then you never revert to egocentricity as it was before. So your sense of a path is that it is a series of climactic events that happen as you practice. There's a certain kind of feels like there might be some kind of compelling truth about that, because you feel that as you go on, that there are revelations of that kind that happen to you. And you feel, well, maybe that is exactly what the path of the Buddha is about, realizing things in some kind of sequence. But that just seems to be part of the story. The idea there is, strangely enough, it would seem that there's a sense of subtle self-protection involved in thinking of things in that way. Because you think, well, when I've reached this particular stage, I won't slip back further. Because I won't slip back further, I'm secure. So it's like a series of secure points somehow. As though giving away part of a certain type of experience has become an insurance policy. And there's something rather suspicious about that. It might be kind of compelling in some sense that the path ought to be like that. But it would seem the truth of the matter is that there is no insurance policy like that. And in fact, another way of looking at the path is that it is a series of experiences, deepening experiences maybe, where you realize something about the nature of your being, the nature of yourself, the nature of your ego, or whatever it might be. It arises, it expresses itself, and there's a sense in which that fades. Not fades completely, but fades somewhat. Can be, when you look back like that, you feel, well, I've had this experience, and I hold that experience to myself, like it was a key to something. I remember when I was younger and involved with a lot of fellow practitioners who followed a path where we did think of things in terms of a sequence. If we did get a strong experience of some kind, it became strangely enough, an ego credential, even if it was some experience of non-ego. You might say, well, that doesn't make any sense. How could an experience of non-ego become an ego credential? Well, the reason is that, generally speaking, that when you have some experience of non-ego, it's not complete. And there's a trade-off, as it were, for some part of your ego, for the sense that I have insured myself, I think, against falling back on the path at this point. And also, I can tell my friends about it. And not only that, but it becomes a credential for me in the future. You know, maybe I look into the future and maybe I want to become a Buddhist teacher. And I have experiences like that. Like, it's almost like it's my CV. So I've got all these experiences. How wonderful. Hopefully, for one's own sake, one hopes one hasn't got a teacher who falls for that way of looking at things. But that's not invariably true, because sometimes the teachers themselves have been sort of trained or brought up in the same way and actually believe in that system. Whereas the truth of the matter is that there is no necessity to think in terms of realizing something, getting some kudos out of it. Most important thing I remember, David mentioned my primary teacher, Trompa Rinpoche. He said, if you have an experience, he said, never look back at it. Never hug it to yourself. Never think, oh, you know, I've got this thing. And he wrote, whether it was the name of a book or a chapter of a book, he certainly told me, Buddhism without credentials. Buddha Dharma, the practice of the way, doesn't have any kind of security base. As you step onto the path, you're stepping into space. You don't know what's going to happen to you next. As he sometimes said, it's a bit of a crazy thing to do, really. But that's Buddhists for you. It's you often talk about madness in the path, craziness in the path, or whatever, and this is the way it goes. It goes in the way of having the power to step out. That's, in a sense, the only thing you need to. It's difficult to say whether you talk about it as being something you acquire, but something you need to develop a facility for, is that stepping into a space that doesn't have any characteristics. So when you talk about refuge, and for those of you who know the term, taking on what is your basis in Buddhism, your basis is the non-base. Spaciousness. The refuge, that's what you take refuge in, is in a sense, you might say, to take refuge in nothing. But it's not annihilation. Taking refuge in what is really beyond concepts. If you want compassion for others, greatest compassion comes from the basis of non-ego. Having plunged into the sense of non-ego, real compassion arises as a surprise. You couldn't create real compassion. We don't know what it is. I remember someone telling me, one of my teachers, different one this time, talking about someone. He's saying, well, you know, they've practiced all their life developing compassion and using different methods and so on. And then at some point, they had this particular experience. And he said reflectively, maybe that was compassion. It's like everything else that had up to then, which everybody would say. They were a compassionate person, that experiences of direct compassion. None of that really counted because there was too much egocentric spin involved with it. And when the real compassion comes, it comes from something which is an action beyond thought. I'm not saying you mustn't, I suppose, get the wrong idea of thinking, well, those compassionate practices in Buddhism, it's good to jump them. We're not saying that. All we're saying is they're not the thing itself. Thing itself is something beyond that, beyond the compassion that is a paramita, you might say. The skillful means of compassion which is linked directly with wisdom, with prajna paramita. That's the real compassion. The one that you practice without prajna paramita, not because you're a bad person for doing it, but simply because you don't know how to do it. And in fact, you can't know how to do it because it doesn't spring from ego anyway. You prepare the ground, and that's what you can do. And then at some point, what is beyond thought and beyond concepts takes over. And genuine compassion, genuine, as we say, bodhicitta, the union of wisdom and compassion arises. When it does, it's beyond anything that one could imagine. When you're thinking in that way, it becomes irrelevant to talk about the insurance policy of different stages. Sometimes said that in this, the beginnings of this new way of looking at things, we have the idea, you see, that with sequential stages, is that I'm an undeveloped person and I have to practice, and gradually I will develop one is not so crude generally as to think, well, my ego will develop. One hopes not. One thinks, well, maybe my ego will decrease, and my sense of compassion, my sense of involvement with the path will increase, and so on. And it happens in a series of steps. But in fact, from a deeper point of view, the undeveloped state doesn't exist at all. You wanted to arrive, you already had. You already had arrived before you were born. So it's not a question of trying to develop something that will secure yourself. It's learning to work with things as they are. And it's as though the undeveloped state that we all have is covered over by a kind of confusion, bit like we want to look at the sun and we look at it through a dirty window. You know, the sun is always there. The sun of your being, the sun of natural wisdom and compassion, you already have that. It's no good saying, I want to attain that. You can't attain the sun. You know, the sun's just there. The sun, if you like, even in the confused way, is what's actually created your apparent existence in this world. You know, you wouldn't appear to be at all if it weren't for the fact that power was there intrinsically. But we don't see the nature of it because it's covered over by our confusion. And that's considered to be important that you have a teacher that trains you out of that. But perhaps the most important thing is to recognize that everything that appears to you in your life is simply the distorted form of something genuine. It doesn't matter what it is. Might be the most horrible things. It might be the development of overwhelming hatred or desire, or as I said, paranoia, pride, or whatever. They all correspond to something in the nature of your being. And that aspect of your nature doesn't need correcting. In fact, it can't be corrected. It's just the way it is. It's just like that. if there is a job to be done, the job is to not to create those things as stages, as you might have thought in the first one, but simply to remove the obstructions. And it's very important when you think in those terms that there isn't anything that you can't work with in this world. You might have heard that kind of things described in the Mahayana and in the Tantras and so forth, that you need to work like that. But even then, that's not the end of the story either. Because the underdeveloped state does not exist. The undeveloped state does not exist. How did it get covered over in the first place? And the most subtle approach here is that it was never covered over either. So there's no undeveloped state, and there's no mud that covers things up. What there is misdirection. You look at things and you don't see things the way they are. So it's quite a subtle thing. In some sense, it's a very small thing. As Trungpa Rinpoche once described, talking about this kind of thing, he said, suddenly it seems, if you can imagine a person, as it were, being in this undeveloped state, maybe it's like the primordial state, and suddenly this state of samsara, as we say, this word of suffering appears. What terrible thing happened to make that appear? And he said, well, not much. Very tiny thing. You just look for reality continually in the wrong place. You want satisfaction, and you look for it always in what is, in a sense, you might say, projected outwards. You search for it there, in externals. Actually, you naturally have it. So the simple thing is just to see that. And that's less of a job than removing obscurations, just to do that. Nevertheless, you do have to what do you have to do? You can't realise anything because there's nothing to realise. You have to have it pointed out to you by someone. And that's, in this way of looking at things, the teacher is even more important than in the system I was just describing before, when there's, as it were, mud to remove. You need what is called what Tibetans call mudra, which is a pointing out instruction. It needs to be shown to you, and various methods have to be used to do this. Sometimes it's a word, sometimes a phrase, sometimes the use of a symbol, sometimes something quite elaborate, sometimes instructions to meditate in a particular way. There are a lot of methods. Sometimes the teacher knows it's not going to happen for a while anyway. There are famous stories of a student goes to a teacher and says, I've had this uncomfortable, often, experience. What does it mean? I feel quite downcast by it because it wasn't what I expected. And then the teacher's very pleased and he says, that's absolutely wonderful. Now go away for 12 years and do nothing very much. But it's got to mature over that period of time. it's not enough just to have it. You have to kind of rest with it almost. Sometimes to try and work hard at doing something with it could be a mistake. Just to relax might be the thing to do. So there are many stories like that. And that second method I was describing is like what generally you would get in what's called Vajrayana. This third method is what is sometimes described as Ati, or Maha-Ati, as Trungpa Rinpoche used to call it. The most important thing there is that you cannot do it without a teacher, because if you try to do it with just by yourself, what happens is that you create your own version of the teaching, because everything is becomes so dependent on ego, so dependent on your notion of self. And there's a particular way it's sometimes described as to how you go through this process of relating to the teacher, and that's very interesting to look at and to get some understanding of. But possibly that would be too long to go into at the moment. I tried to give some idea of the path. The big error in the path is to become too involved in ego, but to be interested in your mind, your emotions, what happens to you, that's fine. And you do need, at whatever level, to have a teacher. You either need a teacher to instruct you in understanding the Buddha's Dharma, but sometimes at another level you need somebody who can show you how to cut through certain problems. And finally you need a teacher who can point out to you where you've not looked. I remember Trungpa Rinpoche speaking about a friend of mine who decided that he wanted to practice freestyle, as Trungpa Rinpoche called it. That's without a teacher. He said, it's possible, but it's very difficult. And the reason why it's very difficult is one of the reasons you want to practice it freestyle is because you don't want a teacher, and therefore the reason for that usually is because of a certain ego problems that you have. You can't, as Trungpa Rinpoche would say, surrender your ego to somebody else. You may say that's got difficulties, which it may have, so it's very, very important who you choose as a teacher. But if you practice without a teacher, you always have blind spots, always. And it's difficult to know when those blind spots would be removed. Possibly some of them not in this lifetime. The danger is that they might begin to loom very large and it become a very big problem. There is that danger. So I've tried to give a kind of outline of the path and some of its problems. And if anybody has any questions, perhaps now's the time. I don't know whether, I don't see very well, so if somebody just puts their hand up, probably ignore you. But it won't be deliberate. Perhaps David, you could see.
I just had a question about the relation to the teacher which you emphasized.
Mhm.
Could you say a bit more about the frequency with which you recommend one sees that teacher, the nature of that relationship?
It's very difficult to say anything about the frequency. It's not like psychoanalysis, where maybe. I think at one time in psychoanalysis they used to say you should see the analyst every day. Certainly you have no notion like that in the Dharma if you're seeing the Guru. You should certainly, it's quite important to have a close relationship with a teacher. So a kind of teacher who comes, flies in and then flies out again, you don't see from 1 year's end to the other, is rather difficult to work with that. Often it's perhaps you need to see the teacher more often at certain times than at others. Sometimes, you get instruction, you've got enough to be getting on with for quite a while. Sometimes the teacher deliberately how can I describe it? It's not pushing you away, but the teacher won't apparently relate to you for some reason. And it's quite, it might be quite seemingly kind of traumatic for the student. But that's really because the teacher might have noticed in the beginning, if that happens a bit, that the student is too clingy, too grasping towards the teacher. And then at some point much further on the path, there has to be some sense in which the teacher has to be given up as a physical entity you relate to, the quality of what the Guru is, the Guru principle, you might say, has to become more universal. If you're too much, you can focus on that individual, then that's a problem. The teacher notices that, forces you to go somewhere else, puts you in a different situation. After a while, it comes back again. But it's very difficult to say what the time is. But I'll say some other things about it. The nominal period that's given for working with the teacher before you decide whether you're gelling, as it were, is 3 years. Even in that period, you might not be seeing the teacher every day or anything like that, but for certain periods, that would be very important to keep that connection. I mean, it might be more than 3 years, it might be less. The process of working with the teacher initially is that the teacher seems to have all the goodies you ever wanted. So as Trungpa Rinpoche said, I'm sure this could not have been traditionally Tibetan, this image, but it was of quite a telling image. He said he's like Father Christmas. Or he said like sort of manager of a toy shop or something. So he's got everything. He's got a sack of stuff, basically. And what he means by that is that you want teachings of various kinds. The teacher can give you those teachings. And you feel very impressed. You think the teacher is wonderful. Everything in the garden is lovely for quite a while. Within that time, and generally speaking, within the period of relating to the teacher, there's what they call too hot, too cold. So there's the too hot is often it's kind of grasping at the teacher. You think the teacher has everything. I want to be around the teacher all the time. I want that. But this doesn't usually come till the second phase. I don't want to be around the teacher. The second phase comes when you've been very much involved with the teacher, perhaps for quite a while. And then maybe suddenly you think that the teacher actually knows you and knows all the little bits about you that you never suspected anybody would know. And you begin to feel almost like tremendously embarrassed because you feel the teacher can see through you. And when you begin to feel like that, then you feel it would be nice to run away. Put some distance between yourself and the teacher. That's the cool aspect. So at that point you really need to be drawn a bit closer, whereas in the second one, when the heat of the grasping is there, you need to be moved farther away. The teacher tries to explain to you what's going on, but often it's very difficult. If the first one is the teacher as Father Christmas, second one is the teacher as judge. And he's not really judging you at all, but you think he is. And you think he's got an attitude to you where he's going to not like what I do. He won't be able to, it's like saying, he won't be able to relate to everything I do. Which is, of course, the teacher's job is really to relate to everything and to work with that. That's what he does from his side. But you feel so embarrassed about this particular situation, or just the relationship in general. You can't believe that could possibly be true. And so you have to go through that period of working with the teacher as well. Then at some point, the relationship becomes much more even. You begin to work together. The teacher's an absolutely necessary part of your life, but you don't think in terms of this tremendously greedy attitude towards the teacher, nor do you have the idea of is some kind of judge. It's almost like you could expose what you are to the teacher, and that is part of your relationship, that you could do that. While this happens, I'm trying to pick out some things that are important and go through it all would take a little while. If you start becoming excessively greedy, you may want to think of the Guru as I said, like Father Christmas, and then changes from Father Christmas to, as the phrase is, musk deer or musk ox. The teacher has the teachings not now as kind of toys, but as musk. Because if I take the musk somehow, I could become a teacher too. I could be respected like the teacher is respected. Maybe, I feel this doesn't work in the West, but I think it did in Tibet. I could sell the teachings somehow. I mean, I wouldn't overtly do it, but I could make it appear by having these teachings, maybe. And of course, the custom in Tibet would be give teacher a gift to receive a teaching, so that that wouldn't, as I say, work perhaps so well in our culture, but I think that in Tibet. So it becomes of financial benefit in Tibet to be a person who has, as it were, taken the teacher's teachings and you purvey them yourself. Over here, it would be more the kudos, I think, of wanting to be the teacher. That would be a big mistake. What you're doing is killing the relationship that you have with the teacher when you do that, because you're treating the teacher as just as an object. So that's a thing to avoid if you think you're kind of moving in that direction. I think perhaps the last thing I would say in response to this question, although as I say there are other things, is why it is said, for example, you should obey the teacher, why you should do what you're told. And there's a lot of maybe various reasons given why it's like that, or the samaya, the special connection you have with the teacher. And they say, well, it's a very powerful kind of thing, you shouldn't break it. But then it's just somebody saying, well, you shouldn't break it because it's very powerful, because something bad might happen to you. But often it's not very said very often why that's true. And in fact, the why is quite simple. As you work with the teacher and genuine experiences begin to arise, genuine experiences like the ones I was referring to before, when you begin to have experience, some experience of non-ego, some experience perhaps of going beyond the 3 times, or the notion of place, or whatever. These things begin to be a genuine reality for you. They become identified with the person who taught you that particular method, because it never is that it's just taught you just as a series of techniques. There's something else. There's something about the conviction power that comes from the teacher, or the way the teacher is in his or her ability to explain things. And what happens then is that the teacher begins to embody the teaching. And that kind of shadows what happens when, for example, the Buddha says things like, he who sees Dharma sees me. And turned around the other way sometimes, he who sees me sees Dharma. Now, if you like, in a small way and maybe in a great way, that's exactly what happens to the pupil who's practicing in this way. The teacher becomes the Dharma. If you reject the teacher, if you have some problematic aspect of trading off the teacher, then you do it to the Dharma because they've become identified. So the reason why we say you have to obey the teacher is absolutely nothing to thinking, oh, well, the teacher needs that kind of obedience. Well, just because he thinks it's nice, or, it enhances the teacher's status in enlightened society, or whatever it is. Nothing like that at all. If you don't do it, if you don't link into the teacher in that particular way, then you're not linking into the Dharma in that way either. And if you destroy your connection with the teacher by doing that, you destroyed your connection with the Dharma as well. And the Dharma is a special kind of Dharma. It's not a Dharma of just instructions and of learning something, but it's the Dharma of realization. So it would be a very, very powerful and very negative thing to do. And that's the reason. Does that help?
Thank you. Yes.
There are other things to say as well as that unfolds, but it would take a while to go through it. Anything else?
Oh. Sorry. Yes. If the meditator is going through an overwhelming experience, such as the loss of someone, a child, and doesn't try to blot it out, but is open to it,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't cease.
No.
And it seems pointless in a way to meditate when all you're doing is what you're doing anyway, which is being absorbed by this experience.
The thing is, it's quite important in Buddha Dharma to, sound a bit silly what I'm going to say, so I'm just going to say before these things happen, it's good to train first, because we don't know when these things happen, just like we don't know when we're going to die.
No.
But this is the thing in the Buddha Dharma to, as soon as you can, you try and practice and to develop your understanding. Now, all the things I was saying, well, you develop compassion and it's rather limited, excuse me, and it doesn't work very well and so forth. And do you remember I said, still do it anyway? There's a reason for that. And that it's like making a watercourse when there's not much water about. So you make the canals, you dig the canals, and it's a bit of a sweaty kind of job. And you think, well, sometimes you think, and it's so boring doing this, you know. I'm trying to do this, I'm trying to develop this compassion and doing my best to practice, and there's not much water, as it were, from this. I don't feel anything very much. And you do it hopefully because you want to follow the path, because perhaps you want to follow what the teacher says, or because your mates are doing it, or whatever, because it's the Dharma. So you kind of do it. There's that kind of pressure doing it. So it's important to do it. It's very important to do it, actually. Now, funnily enough, in some ways, I mean, it isn't entirely true to say that nothing will happen when you do. People do have experiences of various kinds, and it depends what kind of person you are. But to a large extent, it is preparing something a little bit for the future. So let me give you an example. Supposing you've practiced what is called the meditation of exchanging yourself for others. You think of the terrible things that happen to people in the world, and you try and kind of absorb it away from them using the breath as a medium into yourself. And the positive qualities you have within yourself, you let go towards others. And you keep trying to do that. And it's a meditative practice to do that. And, you know, it's a bit thing that is quite difficult to relate to, because you feel, well, I'm doing this, but, you know, what does it mean? And people ask, you know, am I helping anybody? Should I look round to see if anybody's better for what I'm doing? The answer is, please don't look round if you're ever doing anything like this, because you can bet you'll never find anybody who seems to be benefited by what you're doing. That's actually not the point either. Sometimes it might make you feel a bit sick, really. But that practice of exchanging yourself for others sometimes becomes important, I think always will become important, when pain or misery of loss or something of that nature strikes you. Then automatically your mind will turn to that experience. And you know, I'm not saying it goes like this for everybody, but one kind of thing that can happen is you look for the misery of a child dying, a beloved parent dying, whatever it might be, or becoming very sick, whatever it might be. And because of the way you practiced, immediately you think, this is not just a single experience that's happening to me. I automatically begin to think, this happens to everybody. Not perhaps in exactly the same way as it's happened to me, but it's a general universal experience. In some sense, not just even for human beings. You know, it could be true for animals, and in Buddhist thought, there is the idea that there are many other types of beings than human beings and animals, for that matter. And it's still true. There is that sense of loss. Whenever there's that sense of connection and love, because of the way the universe is, that pain, that poignancy is felt when death occurs. Now, there are two things that can happen if you notice the universe. First of all, a lot of people don't notice the universality of it because they're too overwhelmed by the claustrophobia of what they experience. It's too close and too immediate, and they don't think in general. So it's quite important to due to the fact that you've trained, you begin to feel something immediately. You feel it no matter how strong it is, because it's your son, your daughter, your mother, your father, or whatever it might be. You still have some sense of experiencing that in general. Then there's two things that come from that. One is, if you just happened to notice that and hadn't trained further, you would feel overwhelmed by that, perhaps depressed rather than anything else. That meant that you hadn't completed the meditation technique I was telling you about. But if you go further, you think, when you say I invite this into me, means I really, what it means basically is I feel it tremendously intensely and tremendously strongly. It's just a method for making me feel that. And if I don't allow that to crush me so that it becomes super claustrophobic, I realise a kind of strange thing. I realise that there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. This is a universal experience. I can't do anything to help anybody, actually. And if I realise that completely with the whole of my heart, the bottom drops out of my ego. When that happens, some spontaneous action comes from that ground of non-ego. And that spontaneous action comes from genuine compassion. And that is something that is wholesome and genuine. I don't know what it would be, I can't say. It would vary from person to person. But it would be something genuine, coming from what we call bodhicitta, the awakened heart, comes from that. It won't get rid of the pain of your child dying or your parents dying. It's almost, in some sense, almost driven by that. It's almost the engine that makes spontaneous compassion arise. And the only way that you can do is to embrace that experience. There's probably not more I can say about it than that. Except that is the genuineness of Dharma. The poignancy of those experiences produce the ground of non-ego. From the ground of non-ego, genuine compassion arises. Okay?
Pretty much run out of time. I think we can probably take one more.
Yeah, I think my question might be along similar lines really, but it's about the insecurity that comes from if you lose something, losing a job or losing money, those kind of material things that we haven't relied on here, and the kind of fear that gets generated and the panic and the anxiety, and how to work with that really.
Excuse me. You can do the same things I just suggested, but often it's not necessarily the best method. There are another method that you can use in that situation. The methods are always the same in a way. They always make you realise some kind of universality, always something that causes the ego to collapse, and always some actual action arises from that ground of non-ego. So it's always the same. One method that springs to mind is and it's always associated with what this talk is called turning towards. So you can tell that's what it's about, really. So it's turning towards and embracing the experience. And the interesting thing is, often you may have read, some of you in Buddhism, Vajrayana, Mahayana Buddhism, higher Mahayana Buddhism, you talk about having a consort, as it were, that you link into or embrace. I think that you have to embrace as your consort is the quality of pain. You actually have to dance with that, become part of, perhaps become part of what you are. It is part of what you are already, you can't do anything about it. So why not learn how to relate to that? Why not train to do that? So one way is you think to yourself, this painful experience that comes to me, you have to think in terms, first of all, of what it feels like rather than what I'm going to do about it. First of all, you have to think, perhaps, is there anything I can do about it? You should clear the ground by taking what action you think you want to take about it. Let's suppose you've done that. So either you've done it and you've still got the quality of painfulness there, which often is experienced in terms of worry. So, maybe it's an interview or something. You think, the kind of scenario was, I always make a mess of interviews. Oh dear, how terrible. I will go into this interview and it will be a disaster. Perhaps it won't be a disaster if I think like this. And then you think of little scenarios. And then you still think at the end, oh, but it won't be able to do it. It'll be a disaster, won't it? And then you spend the whole night thinking what a disaster it's going to be. And the problem is not so much thinking that it would be a disaster, but how can I get out of it? That's what you mustn't do. It's easy to say, perhaps, but it actually isn't too difficult to do. It's just not what your ego expects you to do. So you have to turn towards the experience and embrace it and say, if this situation is really embarrassing and very uncomfortable for me, may it be like that. And that's quite a shock to ego, actually, because you think, well, I shouldn't be saying anything like that. And if you go out and embrace that quality of painful quality of what it is to think how I might be a total failure in this particular situation. I'm going to be laughed at. I'm going to be miserable. I'm going to be all those things. They're your experience. Instead of trying to turn away from that, you could embrace it by saying, and it's very important that you're punchy about it, and say, let it be like that. You don't say to yourself, oh, let it be like that, but. There's no but. It has to be that you go for it straight. If you like, you take it by the throat and you really say that. But what you mustn't have is the little idea, oh, if I do this, I'll feel better. You mustn't care about feeling better at all. I could say to you, you probably will feel better, but you mustn't think that. Anyway, that's one approach. If you do that, your ego, it's quite funny how the ego can be treated almost as an external thing. The ego can be suddenly shocked, and it's like almost it turns around here. Yeah, you're not playing the game. You're not supposed to be saying that to me. And maybe your mind begins to relax at that point. And from that, the ground of that, some action may arise. Actually, in the situation that you find yourself in, when it happens. You could even find the whole thing rather amusing, which of course is difficult to believe. Especially if you start thinking, I really need this job. But there's no other way around it, you can't. That method of challenging ego, method of the Kadampas, as they say. Not the new Kadampa I'm not talking about here, but the old Kadampas, who had a very strong practice tradition this way. That's tremendously important. The challenging of ego, the challenging of your own negativity all the time, challenging of your inherent superstitions you hardly know that you have, continually punching at that all the time. Another possibility is, there's the dynamism of ordinary experience. You know, my interview's tomorrow. Well, I'm not going to die tomorrow, but I might, actually. But it wouldn't matter from a Buddhist point of view, because dying is not the end of things, is it? So it's just another example of dynamism. So you're going to end up past that point. So you have a natural energy in what you are that will carry you through that situation. You either will go through it like a person who's been dragged through a hitch backwards, or you ally yourself with that energy and dynamism, become part of it. And kind of glory in the fact that you're moving towards that time. You're nearly there, you're entering the room. Actually, turn all that nervousness into a kind of energy by just realizing you've got it in with, there's nothing you can do about it. You might as well become part of it. You might as well become part of that situation. The power of that situation. If you do that, then interesting things might happen. Anyway, that's just something you could try. It's better than it's better than trying to think of something else and think, I'll blank it out of my mind. That doesn't work. Grab it by the throat. That's the Buddhist way. Don't believe all this stuff about Buddhism being all sweet and gentle and whatever. I mean, we might not want to hurt a fly, but we might certainly want that energy that we turn away from to become our energy, as it were. I don't mean ego's energy, but the kind of energy that there is in being itself. Then, you could be compassionate towards flies. Instead of just thinking, got to put it out before I kill it. Out of the window. Okay. That's either the end.
I think there's another question to draw our comments at this point.
Okay.
So I'd like to thank you for those wonderfully uncompromising teachers. And ask that you come again to teach us in the future.
I'm very happy to come if I'm asked. Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.